Welcome, everyone. My name is Sharon Farish, and I'm a co-founder of Heron Hospice Society of Delta. Welcome to our webinar, the third for Heron Hospice Society. Our society is committed to providing community education on topics related to end of life. Please note that we are recording this session and it will be posted on our website for future reference. You can visit our website at heronhospice.org and it will be under the resources page. At this point, I'd like to introduce you to Gina Gaspard, who will be our host for this session today. Gina?
Thanks, Sharon. Welcome. I'm Gina Gaspard, your host for this evening's session, handling financial matters after the loss of a loved one. I acknowledge that I live, work, and play on the traditional ancestral territory of the Tsawwassen First Nation people. You may recall a membership survey last year. Tonight's topic was the third most requested. The first and second most requested topics were advanced care planning and medical assistance in dying. Both of these topics were aired last October, and if you missed them, the recordings can be found on the Heron Hospice website, as Sharon just mentioned. Please don't hesitate to share any additional topic ideas with us. We are listening. Tonight's presentation will be 30 minutes with time for questions at the end. Please feel free to enter your questions in the chat as they come to mind. This session will be recorded and uploaded on the Heron Hospice website. So for the protection of your privacy, participants will be on mute with the video cameras off. Recording will stop during the question period. And now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's guest speaker, Donna Ellis. Donna was a chartered accountant for over 35 years. She has worked primarily in management and financial roles for healthcare and elder service. Most recently, she was the CEO of Kin Village, a nonprofit Tsawwassen organization which offers housing, healthcare, and wellness services for older adults. Additionally, Donna has personal experience handling financial matters following a death. Please join me in welcoming Donna as our guest speaker tonight.
Thank you, Gina. I'd also like to say thank you to Heron Hospice Society for inviting me to do this webinar. I just want to reiterate, I am not a lawyer and I'm no longer a chartered accountant, but I do have some experience dealing with financial and other matters after the loss of a loved one. And I'm very happy to share some of the information that I've learned over those experiences. So dealing with financial matters after somebody has died is a part of the experience of death. And just like every death is different, handling the affairs of someone who has died can also be very different. Sometimes it's relatively simple and it can also be very complex. So today it's going to be a kind of leaning on the basic side of things to give you some basic understanding of what needs to be done after someone dies. So what we'll cover, the types of financial and other related items, a little bit about estates and executors, some information about financial items in general, and then we'll look at some specific items that might be of interest. Important documents, also provide some suggestions for key contacts and resources, and some suggestions and tips. So to begin with, what are we talking about? I tend to think of the information, financial information, in kind of four categories. So the first one is assets, which is things that are positive, like bank accounts, investments, maybe a home. And that action that typically needs to be done after somebody dies is identifying the assets of the deceased person, acquiring the assets, potentially investing assets, and ultimately ensuring that net assets are distributed. The second category is debts. So things like credit cards, mortgages, loans, online shopping accounts. And the action that will need to be taken is making sure that debts are paid and also stopping expenses. The third category is income taxes. These could be either an asset or a liability, depending on whether the deceased person needs to pay income taxes or whether there are taxes or refunds due to the person. So the action there is required to file income tax returns, to either pay income taxes or collect refunds, and then to get clearance from the government regarding the income taxes of the person. The fourth category is identity theft and fraud. So this is things related to financial. So it's driver's license, passports, online accounts and social media. And the action that's required there is to simply, not so simply perhaps, but to notify agencies that the loved one has died. So we're not going to focus very much on that last category of identity and theft fraud, but just to be aware that those are kind of related items that often have to be attended to. So to start with, there's an important distinction about the quality of assets. There's 3 types of assets, and each of them are handled differently after someone dies. So the first category is jointly held assets with the right of survivorship. This could be bank accounts, investments, it could be a home. Often it's a husband and wife who may have things in joint names. So bank accounts, let's say, or they may have joint title on a home. And if one person dies, then the ownership basically reverts to the survivor. The approach in that case, dealing with those assets, is really the joint owner or the survivor or the executor of the estate can initiate the change to make the account, the home, whatever the asset is, to sole ownership by contacting the bank and or so on. The second category are beneficiary designated assets. Examples of those would be pensions, RRSPs, life insurance proceeds, RIFs. This is where a beneficiary has been named on the pension or the life insurance and whatnot. Typically, it would be a spouse named as the beneficiary. And that means that those assets could go to the beneficiary directly rather than having to go through the estate. So for instance, on a pension, if the deceased person was already collecting a pension, there may be a survivor pension that will go to the surviving spouse. If the person contributed to a pension plan but wasn't of an age yet where they were collecting it, there may be some deferred pension benefit to the beneficiary. So the approach in this case is that designated beneficiary, let's say it's the spouse or the executor, would contact the provider of the pension, the life insurance, or so on, to acquire the asset or income stream if it's relevant. Next slide, please. So the next category is basically everything else. So everything else that doesn't fall into one of the first 2 categories is considered estate assets. So anything that the deceased person owned, their property and belongings, or anything that they were entitled to upon their death. Little note made here that estate assets are subject to probate fees in British Columbia if the estate value is more than $25,000. Generally, probate fees are 1.4% of gross assets of an estate. The approach in dealing with this is that there will be an executor either named in the deceased will to carry out the will's instructions, or an administrator appointed by a court to administer the deceased's affairs. Now, I'm going to use the word executor.
I'll come text you later.
Okay.
I'm going to use the word executor throughout the presentation, but when I use that word, it equally applies to an administrator. An administrator has the same duties as an executor. The only difference is how they receive their authority. So an executor is named in a will, an administrator is appointed by the court. And someone can be appointed to be an administrator, as, for example, a family member, if there is no will, or if there's a will with no executor named, or if there's a will and an executor or executors were named, but they are not able to take on those responsibilities. So the role of the executor or administrator is to find, and if necessary, probate the will. They need to protect and distribute the assets, pay the outstanding debts and taxes, and prepare a final accounting for the beneficiaries of the estate. Next slide. So before getting into some specific financial items in general, there are a lot of financial items to deal with, but there are also a lot of checklists that are available as a guide. For example, from funeral homes, from financial institutions or governments. Typically, these checklists will list the items that should be considered, and they'll often give a sense of the priority or the timing or the urgency. And later on in the presentation, I'll provide a couple of examples of checklists. The next thing that people have to do then is find all the financially relevant documentation belonging to the person who died. Now, you could find that, for example, if the person has left some files where they've kept all their financial information, or they've kept a list or something like that. If they haven't, then it becomes a bit more of a detective work where you have to look at mail, emails, and try and figure out what their assets are and what their expenses are and so on. Then it's a matter of contacting relevant agencies, and agencies such as banks, government departments, credit card companies, pension agencies, and so on. And they'll each advise what they're going to need in order to deal with that asset. Most of them will require a copy of the death certificate. Several will require certified copies. Some will also require a copy of the will, and some, typically banks, will require probate or letters of administration, which provides the legal authority to deal with an estate. My experience is when contacting agencies, including government agencies, is that they're always very helpful and kind when they know that someone's dealing with the loss of a loved one in these financial matters. So next slide, please. So now that we've covered some general information about assets, let's talk about some specifics that might be of interest. The specific items following a death will depend on the person who died. So some of them that could be relevant would be salary. So if the deceased was employed, then the action would be to notify the employer of the death. There might be wages owing, for example, up to the date of death, and there could be vacation pay outstanding. There could be back pay for retroactive increases or whatever. So the Human Resources Department of an organization can identify if there are other benefits. Some may have benefit plans that include a death benefit. There could be life insurance. There may be a group health plan which covers the spouse and children of the deceased that may carry on for some time, and there may be a pension plan. So the Human Resources Department would be able to provide all the information related to the employment. There may be a company pension. So if that's the case, then typically the executor would contact the pension agency, or it might be the employer or former employer who could make that connection. If the deceased is not yet retired, there could be a lump sum payment or a deferred pension benefit, for example, to a surviving spouse or to other beneficiaries. If they are retired, there might be a survivor pension or a transfer of other pension benefits to a spouse. That would depend on the terms of the pension. There are also federal government pension plans and other benefits. Fortunately, the Government of Canada provides a single point of contact for everything related to federal government programs, with the exception of income taxes. So Service Canada is the contact. They can be contacted in person or most likely by phone, and they will require information about the date of death and so on. The reason Service Canada, it's important to contact Service Canada, is that any payments that the deceased person might have been receiving, for example, CPP, those payments can be stopped after the month of death. And also Service Canada can help determine if there's eligibility for other federal benefits as a result of the death. The Canada Pension Plan is probably the most common benefit. It's a one-time $2,500 payment if qualified, generally, which means that the person who died had contributed to CPP. Generally, the executor applies for that within 60 days of death, though if that doesn't happen, another person such as a spouse or a child could apply for that. The Canada Pension Plan survivor benefit is a possibility. The deceased spouse and her children might be entitled to monthly survivor benefits, and Old Age Security could also have some monthly survivor payments to a spouse. So it's important to contact the bank relatively quickly after someone has died. And this will be to get information and to deal with bank accounts, credit cards, safety deposit boxes, mortgages, and loans. It's important because a person has died, but money is still going to be coming in related to that person and or their death, and there will be payments that will need to be made. And so the bank representative will be able to explain what kind of documentation will be required regarding the estate and the death. They'll be able to provide information about accessing a safety deposit box and identifying if any account changes are needed. Next slide, please. I think it's worth noting that when someone dies, often if it's an individual's bank account, the bank account would be could typically be frozen, but some limited expenses and revenues can continue to flow through that account even though it's frozen. So for instance, funeral expenses, utility bills, property taxes can probably still be paid. The bank will let you know. And if something like a Canada Pension Plan or old age security payment is coming in later in a month when someone has died earlier in the month, that could still end up being deposited. So the bank will be able to advise about that. The bank will want to make sure that they're dealing with an authorized person. So generally they will require the will to be probated. They could make an exception to that if it's a small estate. So if it's under, say, $25,000, again, each bank may have different rules about that. And the bank will also be able to provide you with a list of any loans or liabilities or amounts owing to the bank, or their mortgages, lines of credit, that kind of thing, car loans, and whether any of the loans were insured. So sometimes people have insurance on mortgages. So if they die, then their mortgage is paid off or there's a lump sum. So they would be able to let you know that as well. Insurance is another typical category that needs to be considered and followed up. Generally, the executor would need a copy of the life insurance policy, and then would contact the life insurance company, or it could be the employer if it was through the employer, to initiate payment to the named beneficiary if there is one, or to the estate. There could also be some other insurance available that it's worth considering. Sometimes a surviving spouse's employer may provide a death benefit or something like that. There might also be some insurance available through membership organizations if the person who died was a member of a professional association. And if the deceased was involved in a travel accident, a car, plane, or train, it's worth checking if their credit card or if they were an auto club member provides any insurance. Principal residence. If a home is owned in joint tenancy with right of survivorship, typically spouses, then title can be passed to the surviving joint owner. If the deceased was a sole owner and left a principal residence to beneficiaries named in a will, then it may be possible to transfer title or sell and distribute proceeds to the beneficiaries. If there is real estate involved, usually a principal residence, if anything, then I would strongly suggest consulting with a notary or a lawyer. Canada Revenue Agency. So Canada Revenue Agency needs to be contacted separately from the rest of the federal government. It has a 1-800 number as well, which can be called to advise of a death, at which you would need to provide the social insurance number and some other basic information like date of birth, date of death, and the address of the deceased. Or you can complete and submit a form from the Canada Revenue Agency that's available online. Just to note that if there is no executor or administrator of the estate, a person can request to be a legal representative purely for income tax purposes. You might or might not want to consider doing that. I don't think it happens that often, but you can apply to do solely for income tax purposes. Next slide. So the responsibilities related to taxes, filing tax returns. There is a minimum one tax return that will have to be filed from January 1st to the date of death. A return has to be filed if the person died between January 1 and October 31st of the prior year, then a return has to be filed by the normal date of April 30th. If the person died within the last 2 months of the year, then the return needs to be filed within 6 months. So if a person died December 28th, it would have to be filed by June 28th. There are also 3 optional tax returns, and those would be considered if there was maybe a tax advantage, because that can happen because you can claim some deductions against income essentially twice, I guess, like a personal amount, an age amount, or a pension deduction. So you could consider doing that. The most common of those is called rights and things, and that's for reporting amounts that the deceased was entitled to, but that were unpaid as of the date of death. I think a very common one would be Canada Pension Plan or Old Age Security. So if a person died December the 15th and they then received Canada Pension Plan payment, they would receive still a Canadian Pension Plan payment in that month, later in the month of December, because those payments typically come in at the end of the month. That could be filed as income on a rights and things return. There could be a tax return required for the estate if and only if the estate earns income after the deceased died and before assets are distributed. And the other returns that would have to be filed is anything that's outstanding from prior years. So just a note, if somebody died February 15th of 2022, then there would need to be a return filed from January 1st to February 15th of 2022. And most likely there would be an outstanding return from 2021 as well. I really suggest getting help with taxes because I think it's often something that's quite stressful, and you want to make sure that your taxes are minimized and that you protect your sanity. There's a lot of things to deal with. So unless you really enjoy doing income taxes and do your own taxes, this isn't probably the easiest thing to do on your own. It is possible, but it takes some effort for sure. The final item related to the Canada Revenue Agency is a tax clearance certificate. And that is a written confirmation from the CRA that all the tax liabilities have been paid. The executor applies for that once the notice of assessment for the final tax return is received. And getting that clearance certificate is really important because it relieves the executor of any personal liability for future taxes. And so even though an executor might distribute some of the estate assets before getting a clearance certificate, it's really important to make sure that enough money is kept by the executor in the estate to be able to pay any outstanding taxes. And so final payments to beneficiaries aren't made until after the clearance certificate is received. So moving on, the most important documents. Well, the death certificate is very important because it provides proof of the death. Many services and organizations will require that, either a certified copy or a copy as that proof. Funeral homes typically will provide the executor with that or the family with that. And I would suggest that the executor gets several certified copies from the funeral home, because many of the organizations contacted are going to require a certified copy. A will is a very important document as well. It is the document that's left by the person who's died that lets the executor know what to do with the person's estate. The probate is a process that ensures the will is real and verifies who is authorized, i.e. the executor. And as I mentioned earlier, that will be required typically by banks, unless my experience is unless the estate is very small. And the probate process really provides protection and assurance that to the banks, let's say, that the person they're dealing with is authorized and that the will is valid. The last income tax return is also important because it helps the executor know to what point taxes have been paid and assessed. And it also provides some sort of baseline information for completing the last tax return of the individual that died. There's lots of other useful documents, any of the things that we sort of mentioned before, like passports, titles, deeds to property, insurance policies, pension statements, but those 3 are the most important. So fortunately, there are lots of resources and contacts of people that are willing to help, either providing you with lists or providing you with information when you contact them. There are lots of good checklists My experience is that funeral homes provide really good ones. So if you're dealing with a funeral home, they will probably provide you with something. Can you go back, please? Thank you. The BC government has a checklist on the website that's noted here, and it provides a lot of really great information about contacting different agencies within the government, such as to do with driver's licenses and so on. I also Googled, I just Googled a checklist when someone dies, and I noted here one that I thought was quite good from RBC Wealth Management that also provides some good information about what to expect when someone dies. And as part of that, it provides a checklist at the back. The professionals, if you engage professionals, or if the executor engages professionals to help to administer an estate, then the professionals will also be a really good source of knowing what information is going to be needed to settle the estate. So Service Canada, as I mentioned, has a 1-800 line. They also have offices, but a phone call is usually a great place to start. Sorry, that's Service Canada. Service BC also has a phone number, and they have centers you can go to as well. I think phoning is always the best way to start. Same for Canada Revenue Agency, 1-800 number. The CRA has a couple of really good documents online as well. One is called What to Do Following a Death, and the other is Preparing Returns for Deceased Persons. So the first one gives information about what you should do immediately in terms of contacting the CRA. And then if you do want to prepare returns, there's lots of detailed information on that. And for Indigenous people, there's some other contact information here for assistance. So just some suggestions and tips. So there is a lot to do after someone we love dies. And we can do some things before we die to ease the burden on our loved ones associated with our financial affairs. So, and these things can help to minimize expense, time, and stress, which I think is a gift to give to those who you're leaving behind. So first, have a will and review and update it when your circumstances change. So for instance, if maybe some of your key beneficiaries predecease you, maybe you just come into more assets and you want to make different decisions about how those are distributed, then you should change your will periodically if that happens. Streamlining finances. So consider whether you need several credit cards, bank accounts, and investments. It will be easier for someone to deal with if you consolidate those as much as possible. Insuring assets like your home, your bank accounts, are joint with right of survivorship, if that's what you intend. So typically joint assets would be spouses, and joint assets will be quicker to deal, they'll be quicker to deal with and not as costly because you avoid probate fees and the assets can just be transferred into that survivor's name. Typically, as I said, it is used for spouses, but it's possible that an adult child who's a sole beneficiary of your assets could be a joint owner. I will just say a caution because there is a potential for financial abuse when someone is a joint owner of your assets, your home, your accounts, and so on. So that really requires a high level of trust. Consider designating beneficiaries other than estate on assets like RRSPs, RIFs, pensions, and tax-free savings accounts, because then those won't be subject to probate and probate fees. And just to note that there can be multiple beneficiaries, and registered charities can be included as beneficiaries as well. And there could be tax advantage to that if you intend to leave some assets to a charity, a registered charity. And the final one is to safely keep a financial inventory and a will that's easily accessible to the executor. The financial inventory should include the documents that are important or an identification of where they're located. So a will, your assets, your bank accounts, your liabilities, do you have loans? What are your income streams? Are you getting salary? Are you getting CPP? Do you have a company pension? What expenses do you pay every month or every year? And also should include a list of your trusted advisors. So if you have an investment advisor, for example, and passwords to access online accounts. So there are lots of templates available online for financial inventory. I developed one for my own use that I'm going to share with Heron Hospice, which they can share with participants if you're interested. It's just a basic Word document, so it can be printed off and completed manually, or it can be done online so that it's easier to update periodically. It's quite comprehensive, and I completed it for myself, and I just ignored things that weren't relevant to my individual circumstances. But so that'll be available for you. So following a death, there's lots to do at a time when we're grieving, when our energy is likely low, and our brain can be a bit foggy. So many people might be surprised at how long it takes for dealing with all the financial items. For example, my mom's estate in 2018 was about as simple as it could possibly be, with lots of her all of her assets being in joint name with myself. And it still took about a year before I got the clearance certificate from Revenue Canada and then distributed the assets to the rest of the family members. So important to just take it one step at a time and set priorities. You want to make sure that if there's a survivor, that they continue to receive income, if, for instance, a pension should be coming to them, and you want to know about government time limits for applying things. So the checklist will really help with that. Consider engaging help, so either hiring professionals or engaging family members or close friends if they have some skills and some energy to assist you with certain tasks. And really, really importantly, keep a record. So I kept a binder, but have a binder or a file folder from start to finish until you've dealt with all the assets. They've been distributed to the beneficiaries. And so that you know who you've talked to and when and what advice you've gotten and the status of things and copies of all the records until you've managed to complete the distribution of all the assets in the estate. So that's it for the presentation. I'm happy to answer questions to the best of my ability. Again, these information is based on my experiences, and hopefully I will have some answers. And if not, that well, we'll see. We'll see how we do.
Thank you, Donna. Wow, that was a lot of amazing information in a very short period of time. Thank you so much. I'm not sure if everybody's aware of the chat. If you move your mouse on your screen, all of you, then the word chat comes up on my screen. It comes at the bottom, and if you just click on it, then you can type in. So I did actually type a question in as you were talking, and my question is, as other people are hopefully thinking up their questions, I'll ask mine. How many, you said that to make sure to get a number of death certificates. I just wondered, Donna, how many roughly death certificates would you recommend?
Well, I got 6 or 8 for my mother's estate, which was very simple. So if I mean, it doesn't hurt to have more and shred them after. So I would probably say 10 to 12.
10 to 12. Okay.
Yeah, it doesn't hurt. It's just one piece of paper and you shred them if you don't need them.
And I understand it can be expensive to get them afterwards.
Well, it's not terribly expensive. You can go to a notary, for example, and get them certified. But yes, it's just one less step you have to do, right? It saves you a bit of cost, but really, probably more importantly, it just saves you time and hassle. Yeah, extra work.
Okay. So we do have a question about that. And is there a cost to getting death certificates?
I had no cost charged by the funeral home that I dealt with, so I don't know if that's typical or not.
Okay.
It's part of the service, I think, that they normally provide, but not sure if that's true for all.
Another question we have, Donna, is what does the probate process entail?
Well, that's a good question that I don't think I can't say too much about, because I've never actually, well, I've probated an estate, but I did it through a lawyer, so they dealt with the paperwork. But I mean, basically my understanding is you need to document, you will provide the will, and you will have to provide a list of all the assets of the estate. I'm not sure if you have to provide a list of the expenses, and then you'll have to pay based on what the total assets are. So I'm sorry, I can't really say how long that process takes, but you have to collect some information before you can apply for probate. And I'm guessing, I think I did read something about a few weeks, but I don't really know the answer to that.
And
I'm
who
sure
does it? Who does the probate?
Well, it's by the court. So I think if you went online, maybe that should have been in our resources. If you go online and just do probating a will in BC, or there's actually a very good website, which I made a note of here, which is all kinds of legal information for people who like to look online. I'll just try and find that here. The People's Law School.ca. So that's a BC organization, and there's a section called Wills and Estates, and they provide all kinds of information about the legal process associated with wills and estates.
Great. I'm just going to type that and put it into the chat so people have it. The People's Law School.
Peopleslawschool.ca. Yeah, it's a BC. It's a BC organization.
They have some great resources. Yeah, it's a good. All right. Are there any other questions out there? Oh, here we have something. So I have in my experience, funeral homes do charge for certified copy. It can be quite expensive. They usually provide one original and then $25 per certified copy.
Oh, wow.
A social worker or bank manager can also certify documents for no charge.
Okay. And sometimes if you take in, like to the bank, if you take in the original, they will make a copy of it. The same thing I think happens with Service Canada. If you take the original in, then they'll take a copy and certify it themselves that it's an original. So that's interesting. Yeah.
Okay. We do have a good, they gave me one copy back each time. So I'm not sure. Janie, can you say more about that? What the question is? Let's give her a minute to type in her question. Maybe I'm just not understanding it. So she says, I had 5, but they just kept photocopying and giving the one copy back. So it didn't need to be certified, it sounds like.
Yeah, lots of places don't require a certified one, just a copy. But some do require it. So I mean, 10 to 12 would be, I think, that's the outside estimate. As I say, I think I asked for 6 and I probably used 3. Because as I say, some places you bring in the original and then they'll make the copy and they'll note on it that they saw the original.
Okay. So any other questions from people? I want to make sure everybody has an opportunity now that we have you here. I'm just had a comment, very helpful and much appreciated. So on that note, I would like to thank you so much, Donna, for taking time and sharing your time with Heron Hospice to share your expertise and both personally and professionally. I also want to give a special thank you to Andy Teal, who's our IT genius and very humble, didn't want to have his name mentioned, but I told him I was going to mention it anyways. And to Sharon Farish, who is one of our wonderful leaders at Heron Hospice that makes all of this come together so smoothly. So thank you very much, everybody. If anyone has any suggestions for future education, we'd love to hear it. We did do a survey back in July, and we'll continue on with the list that we received from the survey, but it's not too late to put in your suggestions.
I'd just like to finish up by saying thank you to Gina and especially to Donna for putting all this information together for us. I will be following up with an email to everyone who registered. That will include the personal inventory that Donna mentioned that she had so generously prepared for us, as well as a brief survey. We want to ensure that we're meeting the needs of the community and find ways to improve these webinars. And there's also an opportunity there to suggest future topics. So thank you for joining us tonight, and enjoy the rest of your evening.